我们可以挥挥手跟 Santos 挥挥手吗？他可以看得到我们。
So please wave to Professor.
Thank you so much. 好，接下来呢，我们要把时间交。
So now we're going to hand over to Professor Santos, and she will talk about the age of emotion. How do you learn to be happy? Over to you, Professor.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here today at the Bazaar at Work Summit. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm excited to talk to you about how we can all learn to be happy, and in particular, how leaders from all cultures can promote happiness at work. I'll start by telling you a little bit about how I got interested in the science of happiness, and particularly happiness at work. But then I'll spend most of my time talking about the kinds of things that we can do across different cultures to improve our happiness at work, and also why it matters so much. But just to get started, as mentioned, I'm a faculty member here at Yale University. I've been teaching there for over 2 decades. But in just the last couple years, I took on a new role on campus. I became what's called a head of college. And that means I live with students on campus. I see them really up close and personal. And at the time, I didn't like what I was experiencing. I was seeing the college student mental health crisis really closely, where so many students right now in the US and across the world are experiencing things like anxiety, depression, even thinking about suicide. And so I wanted to do something about it. And that was why I decided to develop a totally new class for Yale students, one where they could learn about what the science really shows they could do to promote happiness. But it was a new class on campus. I wasn't sure how many students would take it. You heard the punchline, which is that when I offered this new class, Psychology and the Good Life, in fact, lots of students took it. This is what it looks like when a quarter of all the students at Yale University are taking your class. So it was a very big classroom. But this was important. It taught me that students really care about promoting their mental health, and they wanted to do something to protect it. But that was all the way back in 2018, where I think it was kind of early to be thinking about our mental health. When we fast forward to 2024, I think it's safe to say, as my students might say, that it's been a bit of a dumpster fire when it comes to our well-being. Things are not good. And that's for lots of reasons, right? We've just come out of this global pandemic. I think we're experiencing lots of kind of fears around the economy and what's happening in the world. It can make sense to feel a little bit scared about what's going on at work. It can make sense to feel really uncertain. And that raises an interesting question, which is, how can we all become happier? How can we all promote our happiness at work in this year where we really find ourselves? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to be walking through the top 10 insights that come from the science of happiness about how we can promote our overall well-being at work. And the specific strategies I've chosen are ones that we have evidence work across different cultures. So these are the kinds of things that are going to work whether you're in a workplace in the US, in the UK, in Taiwan, abroad. These are the sorts of practices that we think are universal. And so let's jump into these tips, starting with the biggest insight that we get from the science of happiness, which is that if we really want to promote mental health at work, we need to recognize that happiness matters for your performance. Now, I think we all have a theory about how happiness works. We assume that if we are successful, if we do well at work, we'll feel happy. But we don't think that the pattern goes the other way. In other words, if I focus on my mental health, if I focus on my happiness, then I'll perform better. But what the research shows is that we might have it wrong. In fact, study after study shows that our happiness seems to matter for the bottom line, for our success. How do we know this? Well, we know this from studies that look at this question of, what does being happy predict? What kinds of success criteria does it predict? And one of my favorite studies, which comes from the researcher Ed Diener, asked, does your happiness predict whether or not you're able to get a job in the first place? Ed Diener studied this question in a very interesting way. He took a college freshman and measured their cheerfulness, so one measure of their positive emotion. And what he did was then try to look at whether or not that measure of cheerfulness predicted students' job obtainment, so in other words, whether or not they got a job, not when they were at age 18 as a freshman, but later when they were in their 20s and in their 30s. And what Ed Diener found was that students who were the most cheerful at age 18 were the ones who were not only the ones who were most likely to get a job in their 20s and 30s, but they were also the ones that were more likely to be paid the most money. Now, we all assume that money will equal happiness, that if we got more money, we'd be happier, but we don't think that being happier will get us more money. But that's actually what studies are beginning to show. People who are happier at work wind up being paid more. Now, you might ask the question, like, what's going on? Are we just paying people who are happy more? That seems wrong. No, it turns out that people who are happier are paid more, in part because they have better ideas. Research shows that when we're in a positive mood, we wind up being even more creative. One of my favorite studies looked at this with medical doctors. They brought medical doctors to the lab and gave doctors a really hard medical diagnosis problem. So it was really tough to figure out what disease you were thinking about. But half of the doctors in this study got to be in a good mood first. They just watched some silly cat videos, on YouTube. But they were kind of laughing and in a good mood. What happened? Well, those doctors who were in the good mood wound up coming up with the most creative solution to these tough medical problems. By being in a good mood first, you wind up performing better. You wind up performing more innovatively. And I think this shows us why happiness at work is more important, right? Happiness at work winds up being the kinds of thing that allows us to perform better and that therefore allows us to succeed. And I think that this is really important, an important insight to start with, in part because I think we get this idea of happiness wrong. We assume we have to get to success to be happy, but in fact, focusing on our happiness first might be exactly the kind of thing we need to do to be the most creative workers we can be and the most creative leaders we can be at work. And this is why I like to start my talks with this idea of work-life harmony. I think this is a lovely notion to be presenting at Bazaar at work in Taiwan, because I think it's a very kind of Asian notion in a lot of ways, right? This idea that instead of a work-life balance, where when work goes up, life goes down, we can think of them in harmony, where if you focus on the life part, your mental health and your happiness, you'll wind up working even better. You'll wind up doing more creative work. Now, so far, I've talked to you about work-life harmony at the individual level, but I also think it's worth noting what happens at a company level when you have workers who are more happy. And this is the kind of thing that was recently studied by a group at the University of Oxford. They partnered with the job website Indeed, which is a website where you can rate all kinds of things about your job, your salary, how much you like it, and so on. But Indeed also has ratings of people's happiness at work. In fact, they have ratings of happiness at work for over 15 million workers at over 5,000 different companies. And so the researchers at the University of Oxford came up with a clever way to study the role that happiness at work plays in the success of a company. They asked the question, are the companies that have the happiest workers doing the best in terms of their stock prices? In other words, are happier companies making the most money? And that's what I'm going to show you next in this graph. Even though I'm kind of virtual right now, I'm going to try to nerd out and sort of walk through this graph here. What I'm plotting is across the y-axis, the amount that you'd earn in money if you invested $1,000 in the stock of different kinds of metrics. And you're going to see in the different colors as we go across time on the x-axis, in orange, the S&P 500, in the purple line, the Dow Jones, and in the green line, the NASDAQ 100. So these are the normal kind of indicators of the economy that you would see if you were looking at, say, the Wall Street Journal or a big newspaper. But the other metric I'm plotting, the one that's in blue, is what these researchers called their 100 well-being score. So this is like the Dow Jones or the NASDAQ, but for well-being. It is the top 100 highest, happiest companies in this data sample. And what you can see is if you plot how your investment in a stock would go if you invested in these high well-being companies, what you can see is that that blue line is at the top of all the other lines. What does that mean? That means investing in the top happiest companies would be making you the most money, because those companies with the happiest workers are actually doing the best in terms of their stock performance. What does this all mean? It means that happiness really matters for our performance. It means that any success criteria you look at, from your own individual success to how well your company is doing, it seems to rely on your sense of happiness. That's the biggest insight we start with. And it's one of the reasons I like to start my talk with this image here. I like to think that we need to put our happiness really front and center. We need to make it a big part of our lives at work because it really matters for our success and our performance. But the question is, how do we do that? What tips can we use to become happier at work? That's what the rest of the insights are about. Starting with top insight number 2, which is that if we want to be happier, we need to make time for social connections. Pretty much every available study of happy people around the world finds that happy people are more social. They spend more time with their friends and family members, and they wind up just being around other people more often. In fact, research shows that if you force people to be a bit more social, say talking to a stranger and so on, they wind up feeling a little bit happier. And so to be happier, we need to be social both at work and beyond. But this can be really tricky, right? We all have busy lives and we feel really stressed. Sometimes it doesn't feel easy to kind of reach out and become a little bit more social. So what can we do? Well, studies really suggest that when you're feeling stressed out, it's the time to reach out and connect with somebody. Pick up the phone and call a friend, really connect with someone closely that you care about. What we shouldn't be doing is using our phone in all the ways that we often use our phone, say scrolling through some social media feed. Research shows that if we really want to feel happier, we need to connect with people in real time, right? We don't have to do it in person, but texting, going on a Slack chat, like kind of, if you're not connecting in real time, it doesn't seem to have the psychological kind of reward that we would normally get from connecting in real time. And so that's top insight number 1. If we really want to be happier at work and beyond, we need to make time for social connections. Top insight number 3 is related to top insight number 1. It's another way that other people matter for our happiness. And it's that if we really want to be happier, we should focus on helping others. Helping others makes us happier than we expect. And this kind of goes against some of the insight that we see culturally, at least in the US right now. Because right now in the US, folks don't often talk about doing nice things for others. They talk a lot about doing nice things for yourself. So things like self-care, or a big quote in the US right now is to treat yourself, right? Do something nice for yourself. But if you look at the research, it looks like self-care doesn't improve our happiness as much as we think. In fact, study after study shows that our happiness seems to improve when we do nice things for others. So controlled for income, people who spend more on others wind up being happier than those that spend money on themselves. So if you donate money to charity, you wind up being happier. Controlled for income if you don't. And controlled for the amount of free time people have, those that volunteer and do nice things for others wind up being happier. One of my favorite studies that looked at this was pretty clever. Just walked up to people on the street and handed people some money. And so if you were in this study, this was done in the US, I have US dollars here. Imagine someone walked up to you and just gave you 20 US dollars. But the key is that they'd tell you how to spend it. They'd either say, by the end of the day, you need to spend this money on someone else, do something nice for someone, or by the end of the day, you need to spend the money on yourself, do something selfish. And what they do is just have people rate their happiness at the end of the day. And what they find is that people who spend the money on others wind up being happier at the end of the day, and even at the end of the week, than those that spend the money on someone else. And so this is top insight number 3. If we want to focus on our happiness, we need to focus on ways to help others. And I think this is important as we think about happiness at work. How can you rethink your job as one that's really focused on other people? What are you doing through your work that's helping other people, helping society, and so on? If we can come back to that insight, the data really show that we'll wind up feeling happier at work. So that's top insight number 3. Now we move on to top insight number 4, which is a mindset shift that we need to feel happier. And that's that if we want to be happier at work, we need to make time for gratitude. Gratitude, the simple act of noticing all the blessings in life, all the things that we're thankful for. It sounds easy, but in fact, it can be hard in the modern day. In fact, our natural tendency is what researchers call a negativity bias, where we're constantly thinking about the bad things, all the hassles. That's what we tend to focus on. But happy people don't do that. They spontaneously bring to mind the good things that they're thankful for. And if that doesn't come naturally, you can follow a suggestion that researcher Sonia Lyubomirsky has put forward, which is that you can just spontaneously bring to mind things that you're grateful for. Lyubomirsky has studied what she calls a gratitude list, where you just write down 3 to 5 things that you're grateful for every night. And she finds that in as little as 2 weeks, this can significantly improve your well-being. But thinking about what we're grateful for and writing it down isn't as good as really telling people that we're grateful for them, because oftentimes the things that we're thankful for aren't things, they're people. And this is the kind of thing that Adam Grant and his colleagues has studied. What happens when you express your gratitude to people, particularly at work? He did this in a very clever way. He had individuals, the leaders at a company, truly express their thanks to the workers. This was actually done in university fundraisers. So these are the students and the staff members who have to call alumni to get access to money. What he did was just had some of these fundraisers get to hear from someone who was really grateful. The boss came in and say, hey, I'm really thankful for what you do. Because of what you've done, we can really do even more at the university. The question is, what happened? Well, what Adam Grant found was that those fundraisers who heard the expression of thanks, a sincere expression of gratitude, they wound up performing 1.5 times better on their fundraising. The simple expression of gratitude, of hearing that others are grateful for us, can really improve our performance over time. And so that's top insight number 4. We need to find ways to make time for gratitude. And at work, if we want to be happier and perform better, we need to express our gratitude to others as well. That's top insight number 4. Now we get to top insight number 5, which goes a little bit back to the basics. If we really want to be happier at work, we need to make sure that we're making space for what I'm going to call healthy practices. Those healthy practices matter more than we expect. What do I mean by healthy practices? Well, I mean the simple things like healthy movement, getting in a little bit of exercise. Research shows that a half hour of cardio exercise a day can be as effective at improving well-being as taking an antidepressant medication. So it's just the simple act of moving our body can really make us feel a lot better. But an even more important one that I'm guessing might matter more for individuals in the room isn't exercise, but this. This is sleep. I have to explain to my poor college students what this is because they think sleep is this when they're sort of falling asleep at their desk at school. But research shows that getting enough sleep is really critical for our mental health. To show how important this is, I'm going to show you the results of one study. This is a study by Dinges and colleagues. And what they did was they brought adult subjects into the lab and tested their mood across 3 different kinds of sleep conditions. First, subjects got normal sleep for 2 whole days. What you're supposed to get normal sleep is 7 to 8 hours a night. So these subjects got that for 2 days. Then subjects were deprived sleep. They only got 5 hours a night for a whole week. At the end, the researchers took the subjects back to the normal amount of sleep, so they get another 7 to 8 hours for 2 days. And the question again is just what happened to subjects' mood? And so I'm going to, again, be a little bit nerdy and show you this graph here. I'm plotting what's called a profile of mood score, but basically bigger numbers mean a higher mood. And as you get numbers towards the bottom of the scale, you might look like you're clinically depressed. And here's what we see just after a single week of deprived sleep. Basically, by the end of the week, you really do look like you need the antidepressant medication. But the good news is that we can improve our mood simply by getting more sleep. But to do that, we really need to promote our sleep hygiene. What are you doing to make sure that your room is dark at night? Or maybe that you don't have your phone and the blue light that comes with it? What are you doing to really prioritize sleep so you can make sure you're maximizing your happiness? So that's top insight number 5. We need to make space for these healthy practices and in terms of exercise and sleep. They matter a lot more than we expect. Now we get to top insight number 6, which is another mindset shift that really matters for our happiness. And that is that if we want to feel happier, we need to find ways to be in the present moment so that we can savor the good things. This idea of mindfulness is something that has been talked about cross-culturally. In Asian cultures, it's been talked about in terms of Buddhist practices like mindfulness and so on. It's the kind of thing that everybody's talking about cross-culturally right now. But it's not the thing that everybody's practicing. I would say if we looked cross-culturally, what we'd more see is cases like this. This is my favorite way of showing in a picture what's called mind wandering, where your mind is sort of off going in all kinds of different directions. You're thinking about dinner or that conversation you had with your friend and so on. Researchers estimate that we spend just about 50% of our time mind wandering, which means we're really missing out on the kinds of things that are going on in the world. And this seems to have a big consequence for our happiness, because studies show that when we're mind wandering, we wind up being less happy than if we were just on task. And so how can we find ways to focus on the present moment and really be mindful of where we are? Well, the research gives us 2 strategies. One of them is what's known as savoring, which is just when we pay attention to what's happening, especially if it's a good event. So if you're eating something delicious, What does this taste like? How would I describe this to someone? What does this feel like to me? You just get in the present moment. That's how you can become more mindful in the moment. But there are also lots of practices that you can become more mindful across time. And that is where practices like meditation come in. Again, beginning even in Buddhist traditions and beyond, meditation is a practice where you intentionally focus on something, say your breath or a specific saying. But the act of doing that means you're training your brain to be on task. And studies show that meditators, even novice new meditators, wind up improving their happiness over time through this act of meditating. So meditation not only lets you pay attention more, it allows you to feel happier when you're doing that. And so that's top insight number 6. We need to find ways to be in the present moment. But top insight number 6 has a kind of second part, which is top insight number 7. And that's that we need to be in the present moment, even when the situation is feeling a little bit difficult. And I'm not sure about your present moment situations, but some of mine haven't felt so good. If I was to pick emojis, they would look a little bit like this, right? Or I've been experiencing anxiety or frustration or sadness, right? These negative emotions are normal, but they don't feel good. And our instinct is often to suppress those emotions, to kind of squish them down and pretend they're not happening. But researchers have studied what happens when we suppress our emotions, and the consequences aren't good. One study by James Gross and his colleagues had subjects come into the lab. These subjects had to watch a very sad video, but James Gross told them, whatever you do, pretend that you're not feeling sad. Try to suppress that emotion. Subjects try to do this, but there are consequences. One consequence is that subjects think worse after suppressing their emotions. If you give subjects a memory test, they perform more poorly. But beyond that, subjects are actually stressing out their bodies by suppressing their emotions. If you look at subjects, even in this short laboratory task, they seem to be experiencing cardiac stress. And so we don't want to think worse and feel worse at work when we're suppressing our emotions. And that raises a question of how we can get through our negative emotions. What can we do? And one of my favorite practices to get through negative emotions is a meditation practice. It's one that's been popularized by the meditation teacher Tara Brach, and it goes by the acronym in English of RAIN, R-A-I-N, which in English is an acronym that stands for Recognize, Allow, Investigate, and Nurture. And so let's say you're experiencing a negative emotion. You look at an email from at work and you're feeling frustrated, or you hear some news that makes you sad. You decide, oh, I'll do this RAIN method. And you've already done the first step, which is this recognize step. Recognize that you're feeling a negative emotion and even label what it is. That's step number 1. But then you do the second step, which is A, allow. You commit to allowing the feeling to be there just as it is. You say, I don't have to like this feeling of frustration or sadness, but I'm just going to sit with it. The key, though, is that you give your mind something to do while you're sitting with that emotion. And that's the third step of this RAIN practice, investigate. You say, what does this feeling feel like in my body? Maybe my chest is feeling tight, or maybe my face, is feeling a little clench, right? Maybe I have a craving to check my email or walk away. Don't act on those feelings, just notice. And research shows that this investigate step works really well. When we pay attention to our emotions, they will feel a little bit more intense, but then they'll take their course. Researchers often say these emotions are like a wave. The problem is that we never sit with our emotions long enough for them to kind of go off. But you don't end with that investigate step. There's one more step to this RAIN practice, the N step, and that stands for nurture. How can you take care of yourself with a little bit of self-compassion? How can you take something off your plate? Researchers have studied practices like RAIN in workplaces that experience a lot of stress. So they've studied this, for example, in palliative care workers, these nurses who deal with death on the line all the time. And they find that practices like RAIN can reduce burnout. So this is a really helpful one, a practice that you can bring to work to kind of get through your negative emotions. So that's top insight number 7. We need to find ways to be in the present moment, even when things are difficult. Now we get to top insight number 8, which builds on that last step of RAIN, that RAIN practice you just heard. It builds on the nurture step. It is that if we want to be happier at work, we need to give ourselves the gift of self-compassion. There's lots of stresses in life, but many of the stresses we experience as the worst come from within. They're the pressure that we put on ourselves. They're the high standards that we bring, maybe the impossible standards we bring to work. A lot of the real stress we experience can come from self-criticism. We're our own worst critics. And we do that because I think we assume that it's successful. We assume that if we're very critical, that will improve our performance. But researchers have studied this, and they've found that self-criticism doesn't improve our performance. It leads to things like procrastination and other bad performance problems. A better strategy is what researchers like Kristin Neff, shown here, call self-compassion, the act of treating yourself like a friend. Researchers like Kristin Neff have found that there are three sort of steps to self-compassion. The first is the act of mindfulness, which we've just talked about. You need to recognize, I'm having a hard time right now. I'm feeling frustrated. I'm experiencing failure. You need to be mindful of that negative emotion. The second step of self-compassion is what Kristin Neff calls common humanity. You need to say, and that's just normal. It's normal to experience frustration. It's normal to experience failure. It's a common human emotion. Then the third step is that you agree to treat yourself with self-kindness. You treat yourself like you would treat a good friend, kind of like a good coach. So these are the three steps of self-compassion. Kristin Neff teaches this practice to individuals, and she finds that it has a whole host of happiness benefits, both at work and beyond. One of the happiness benefits that Kristin Neff finds is that individuals who learn self-compassion wind up eating a bit healthier. It's very easy to make choices that benefit yourself in the future when you're not kind of being so self-critical and beating yourself up. Maybe even more relevant at work, Kristin Neff finds that individuals who experience self-compassion wind up procrastinating even less. So it's much easier to get to that hard task at work because you're not beating yourself up inside. And beyond, Kristin Neff finds that if you give yourself compassion, it becomes easier to give compassion to the people that you love. So you're kinder and more compassionate to your spouse, to your children, and to your other teammates at work. And so this is one that I think we all need to bring in and can be so powerful at work. We need to make sure we're giving ourselves this gift of self-compassion, being mindful about what negative emotions we're experiencing, saying, yeah, but I'm only human, and then asking, how can I treat myself with kindness? That's top insight number 8. Now we get to top insight number 9, which builds on ways that we can be specifically happier at work by focusing on our values. Top insight number 9 is that we can find ways to love our job by focusing on what researchers have called our signature strengths. One of the things that I bet we're talking about a lot at the Bazaar at Work Summit is this question of, how do I find purpose at work? How do I find a sense of meaning? What's the point of doing my work at all, right? We all ask these questions, but the answers can be a little bit tricky, right? What are the kinds of things that give us a sense of purpose at work? And researchers like Chris Peterson and Marty Seligman have studied this question. This is another one that they've studied cross-culturally. And they've argued that we can get insight into what gives people purpose by focusing on what they've called your signature strengths. So Peterson and Seligman went around the world, asked people around the world for their values. What are some strengths and things that you just think are universal values that we should all think about? And when they did this survey, they found that there seemed to be 24 different strengths, as they called them, that came up again and again. Here's their big list of character strengths here. I won't kind of read through them in English, but hopefully you can kind of walk through. They're concepts like a notion of bravery or citizenship, idea of something like creativity or kindness, leadership, a kind of zest for life, loving learning, right? These are kind of strengths that we could see cross-culturally where we think, oh, it's good if you have that strength. But if you think about the different strengths that are out there, you might notice that some of these strengths feel like ones that really resonate with you. You might think, for example, well, bravery and citizenship, those are good. But for me, my true strength might be something like curiosity or humor or social intelligence. It doesn't really matter which one it is. It's just the strength and the value that really resonates with you. Peterson and Seligman say that that strength that really resonates with you is what they would call your signature strength. It's the value that when you exercise it, you will feel good at work. It will allow you to experience purpose. And what they've done is they've found that when individuals use their signature strengths at work, all of a sudden work becomes enjoyable. You become happy at work, and work can even become what you might say is your calling, right? Even if you didn't get paid, you would still want to do that sort of thing. That's the power of using our signature strengths. But you might ask, well, how can I use more of my signature strengths at work? Maybe I have a job where it's not obvious how I could bring in concepts like bravery or kindness or love of learning. How do I get creative here? And this is where I really love the work of my former Yale colleague, Amy Resninsky. She has a practice of bringing your strengths to work that she calls job crafting. What is job crafting? Well, it's taking the job description you have and finding a way to bring in all those strengths and values that you have so that you can make your job your own. And the reason I really love Amy's job crafting work is that she studies this practice of job crafting not in really creative jobs, but in hospital janitorial staff workers. So these are people who are cleaning up when people get sick in the hospital. They're washing the linen in hospitals, things like that. You might not think these individuals have really creative jobs. But Amy Resninsky finds that about a third of these hospital janitorial staff workers wind up saying that their job is a calling. And they seem to be the ones that are job crafting. Amy tells these lovely stories of staff workers who consider their job to be, not just cleaning up, but really making people laugh at work, or getting really creative by switching the art around in the hospital rooms and so on. These are individuals who are enjoying their job, performing it really well, and it's in part because they've crafted their jobs to bring in more strengths. And I love Amy's work because if hospital janitorial staff workers can get creative about their jobs, of course, everyone listening here today can do the same. And so that's top insight number 9. We want to find ways that we can love our job by focusing on those values and strengths. And I think to bring this one to the work that you all do, first, it's important for you and maybe even your teammates and employees to think about what their strengths are, really give some time to focus on these values, but then ask the question, how can you creatively bring those values into the daily tasks that you have at work? The answer to that question can turn your job into a calling. Now we get to the last insight. We are up to number 10, so we're almost done. But this one can be the hardest. Top insight number 10 for being happier at work and beyond is that we need to become wealthy with our time, not necessarily with our money. What do I mean here? Well, social scientists have focused on a concept that they call time affluence, being wealthy in time. It's the opposite of what many of us feel like, where we feel very poor in time. We're what researchers call time famished. And feeling poor in time, feeling like you don't have any time, is very bad for our happiness. In fact, one study by Ashley Willens shows that if you self-report being very poor in time, that's as big a hit to your well-being. It decreases your well-being as much as saying that you're unemployed. If all of you lost your job tomorrow, you'd feel really unhappy. Just feeling like you don't have any time is that bad. And I'm guessing, I can't see all of your faces on the camera, but I'm guessing a lot of you might be making a face like this because many of us feel really poor in time, like we don't have a lot. And so what can we do to get back to this wealthiness in time, to get back to time affluence? Well, one strategy to do better is to spend money to get back time. I'm sure some of you have gone to a restaurant, maybe you've gotten takeout or you took some food to go. We don't like to think of this as a savings in time, as spending our money to get time back, but it really is. If you went out and got a good meal, at a restaurant, that's a meal you didn't have to cook yourself, you didn't have to clean up. You could really say, well, how much time did I save on that? Maybe you saved 20 minutes, an hour, right? What did you do with that time? This act of spending money to get back our time can be really important when it comes to our well-being. But another way that we can get even more time affluence is to make good use of the free time that we do have. And these little small pieces of free time are what researchers call time confetti. Time confetti is like kind of, physical confetti, these little pieces of paper and things, but these are little pieces of time. So when a meeting ends early and you get an extra 5 minutes, or maybe your kids fall asleep and you get that 15 minutes you didn't expect, those are moments of time confetti. The problem is that we don't use our time confetti that well. We just think it's this little bit of time, so we don't really invest it. But studies show that if you invest your time confetti, if you use it towards productive ends, all of a sudden you'll start feeling more wealthy in time. Researcher Ashley Willens recommends making what she calls a time confetti wish list. So this isn't a to-do list like a work list, but it's things you can do with your time confetti that really will make you feel happier. So maybe that's when you write in your gratitude journal. Maybe that's when you call a friend. Maybe that's when you take a moment to do a quick meditation. What can you do to use these small bits of time you do have a little bit more wisely? And so that's top insight number 10. We need to make sure we're focused on wealth, but we need to do that with free time, not necessarily with our money. And so congratulations, you've kind of made it through your own version of a Yale University class. You've gone through all 10 insights from the science of happiness. I hope I've convinced you that there are practices we can do cross-culturally to improve our well-being. If you want to learn more, I encourage you to check out my podcast, The Happiness Lab, where you'll learn lots of these different strategies directly. And I hope I've convinced you that happiness is possible, and that we all have strategies we can do there to get there at work and beyond. And with that, I'll stop my slideshow, and I look forward to all out of your questions. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Dr. Santos, for such an inspiring speech. Thank you. 好，谢谢Santos 给我。
Thank you, Professor Santos, for this wonderful speech. So as mentioned before, we have collected some questions, and thank you very much. So I would like to raise some questions to Professor Santos. First, we have a question from the audience. In high-pressure work environment, how do you suggest employers to make adjustment to help the employees to be more proactive at work?
Yeah, I love this question because I think we really need to think about happiness in these high-pressure environments a little bit differently. I think a high-pressure environment where everyone is performing at their best level, where it's healthy stress and that stress is causing people to improve, that's great. But when the stress level turns into negative emotion, when it means that people are so stressed that they're not resting, they're not having time to sleep, they're not having time for the normal social connections, that winds up being really bad. And it winds up being really bad for performance too. If a high-stress environment is making an employee feel very frustrated, without social connection, no time for exercise, what you've just seen in this talk is that they're going to feel less happy. And the data I showed you at the beginning suggested that happier workers are really the path to better performing workers and a better performing company. And so I think we need to rethink how we talk about high-pressure environments at work and ask the question, what can we do to bring in a little bit of rest? What can we do to bring in a little bit more free time? Our instinct is, oh, that will make people perform less. Maybe they'll have less time at work or they won't do as well. But the research shows we're getting that wrong. That idea that we have is just incorrect. If we could focus on worker happiness, even in high-pressure environments, everyone would be doing better, including the company.
谢谢。
Thank you very much, Professor, for your question. So next time, if there's a typhoon day, well, we can still feel very happy because the employees will be happier. All right, let's move on to the next question. When the manager expectations do not agree with the performance of the employees, how can we show our satisfaction to the team so that we will not lower down the morale?
Yeah, and I think this is an important one, right? Because we have to focus on performance, right? And we have metrics for performance. Sometimes people don't perform as well. I think this is a spot where gratitude can be really helpful, especially if you use gratitude throughout the year. Sometimes there will be times at work when things are very stressful, when maybe people didn't perform very well. But if you're mentioning what you're grateful for that throughout the year, the small things that you're grateful for, all of a sudden you're building up that trust over time. So that when there's a performance review, when someone's not performing well, you can bring that up and you've established a sense of trust. And so I think gratitude research by people like Adam Grant really show it can be the kind of thing that buffers employees and teams from those bad days, from those days of criticism and so on. And so I think it can be a really powerful strategy to employ year round so that when the tough times come, you've built up the trust that you need to succeed.
谢谢 Santos， 更多的感谢。
Thank you so much. So more gratefulness, more appreciation will be a very important trust-building tool. Moving on, so let's move on to the next question. If we would like to live a happier life, Dr. Santos, do you have any more suggestions? How can we start?
Yeah. Well, one of the suggestions is to start small. I feel like all the folks at an event like this really want to be happy, right? You are the intense people who, if I make a suggestion, you'll write it down and do it. And I think this is often a time to start with a little bit of self-compassion, right? Where you take baby steps, you notice if you're feeling overwhelmed and you need a break, and you give yourself access to that. We don't often think of those strategies as ones that improve our performance. Maybe we think they improve our happiness, but the research really shows that time for breaks, time for focusing on our happiness, it matters for much more than we think.
谢谢 Santos。最后一题。
Thank you so much. And for the last question, what kind of specific actions can we take to avoid falling into the so-called happiness trap?
This is an important one. I think when I think of the happiness trap, I think of this idea that we assume that we should be happy all the time. That if we experience a negative emotion, something's gone bad, right? That we should never be sad, we should never feel anxious, we should never feel angry, we should be happy all the time. My students use this phrase, good vibes only, where it's like if there are any bad vibes, something's gone wrong, right? But research shows that this is just not the right notion. A good life is going to have some negative emotions in it. That's just what a healthy life entails. And so I think the happiness trap is believing that you should be happy all the time, but there should be some negative emotions. I think we need to get better at embracing our negative emotions, at being excited when we experience them because they're giving us useful information. I like to think of negative emotions almost like the dashboard in our car. You know, in the US, there's like the engine light and the brakes. And when those lights come on in our car, you know, usually something's wrong. It's not good information, but it's very useful information because then we can take our car to go get fixed. The metaphor I like to use is that our negative emotions are kind of like that dashboard light. It's like a sense of frustration is sort of like our own engine light coming on. And we need to listen to that if we want to be healthy. And so that for me is the happiness trap. We want negative emotions. We want to listen to them. We just need good strategies to listen and get through.
谢谢 Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Santos, for your great sharing. So please give her another big round of applause for her great presentation. We really hope that we can have you in person in Taiwan soon. Thank you for giving us such an inspiring speech. Thank you. Thank you so much.